Today we're going to look at the digestive system, chapter 22. This is part A. For the overview, we're talking about the digestive system, which takes in food, and we need to break down that food into its smallest components. Those components are called monomers. We want to break it down into those nutrient molecules so that we can absorb it in the small intestine. So we absorb nutrients in the small intestine, and then those transport themselves into the bloodstream, unless it's fat, which is transported into a specialized capillary called a lacteal. We'll rid the body of any indigestible foodstuffs, such as nitrogenous waste, or just leftover material that the body cannot absorb. There are two groups of organs that make up the digestive system: the alimentary canal, also known as the gastrointestinal tract or GI tract. This is a passageway open to the outside environment. It goes from the mouth to the anus, and it digests food via chemical and mechanical digestion, and then absorbs the small fragments in the small intestine. The organs of the alimentary canal are the mouth, pharynx, specifically the oro- and laryngopharynx, the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. The accessory digestive organs of the digestive system are the teeth, tongue, gallbladder, and the digestive glands, the salivary glands, liver, and pancreas. The accessory organs are not a part of the alimentary canal, but they do produce secretions or enzymes that are dumped into the alimentary canal. Here we can see structures such as the oral cavity, which contains the tongue, the parts of the pharynx, which are medial or just under the parotid gland here, one of our salivary glands. Our salivary glands include the parotid, sublingual, and submandibular gland. The pharynx is another word for the throat. The oral cavity is connected to the pharynx, which is connected to the esophagus, which is connected to the stomach, which is connected to the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is the duodenum, the second part the jejunum, and then the ileum. So there's three parts to the small intestine, and we can see most of them medial to the parts of the large intestine, including the first part, the cecum, the next part, the ascending colon. Then we have the transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and the anal canal. Not mentioned, but located connected to the cecum, is the appendix, also called the veriform appendix. The end of the anal canal is the anus. There are 6 essential steps or activities to digestion. They include ingestion, propulsion, mechanical breakdown, digestion, also known as chemical digestion, absorption, and defecation. Ingestion includes mastication, which is chewing. Propulsion includes swallowing, and peristalsis. Peristalsis is muscular contraction of the muscularis externa in the alimentary canal that moves food from point A to point B. Mechanical breakdown includes segmentation, another type of muscle contraction that is performed by the muscularis externa, but this type of contraction is going to break down food particles into smaller pieces. This also includes mixing and chewing, even though chewing occurs during ingestion. Chemical digestion is the application of enzymes and other secretions to break down molecules further into their smallest parts, or monomers. Enzymes are commonly going to be used because they can perform catabolic reactions or the breakdown of larger products into smaller products. Absorption is the absorption of nutrients into the blood or the lymph. There are capillaries and specialized lymph vessels located under the enteric cells of the small intestine that are able to absorb these small monomers as they go through or transport themselves across enteric cells. And then the last step, defecation, is elimination of indigestible foodstuffs, commonly nitrogenous waste, things that cannot be broken down. And this does not necessarily include lipids, but depending on certain homeostatic imbalances, you may have difficulty processing foods such as fat, and they may end up in your feces. Here we can see, for example, that most things are absorbed in the small intestine. Things like water that are left over after food moves from your small intestine into your large intestine are absorbed, and that would be mainly water. Once food moves into your large intestine, it is officially considered feces. And we can see the other steps of ingestion as well, including propulsion, chemical and mechanical digestion, and ingestion. Peristalsis and segmentation are muscularis externa movements When the muscularis externa contracts, it can perform either peristalsis or segmentation. Peristalsis is when adjacent segments of the alimentary tract contract and then relax and moves food from point A to point B. Segmentation is when non-adjacent segments of the alimentary tract organs alternately contract and then relax, and this moves food back and forth, so forward then backward, and this mixes food, and it produces a type of slow food propulsion that is associated with mechanical breakdown of food. We also want to talk about GI tract regulatory mechanisms. Those regulatory mechanisms rely on mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors. These mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors respond to changes in stretch and the concentration of ions, which changes osmolarity or pH. And we'll see that if the presence of a substrate such as a protein or the end products of digestion as mechanical digestion occur hit an organ of the alimentary canal, it can influence or initiate reflexes that regulate not only the secretion from digestive glands, but the contraction of smooth muscle of the muscularis externa. When we're looking at the GI tract regulatory mechanisms, we have to mention the intrinsic and extrinsic controls, or control by nerve plexi. Now, short reflexes are when the nerve plexi are responsible for movement of the GI tract itself, whereas long reflexes are when the GI tract nerve plexi have to communicate with the central nervous system, specifically autonomic nerves that send that information to the brain or spinal cord. For example, hormones from cells in the stomach and small intestine stimulate target cells in the same or different organs to secrete or contract by using these long reflexes and communicating information to and then from the central nervous system. And that's what we can see here in figure 22.4 is that the long reflexes involve the central nervous system, whereas the short regulatory mechanisms do not. Next, we're going to look at the peritoneum and the peritoneal cavity. The peritoneum is a serous membrane of the abdominal cavity. Like other serous membranes, it includes a visceral peritoneum and a parietal peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum lines the abdominal pelvic body wall, whereas the visceral peritoneum is on the external surface of most of our alimentary canal or digestive organs. The peritoneal cavity is between the visceral and parietal peritoneum, and it contains fluid that lubricates mobile organs to make sure that we don't produce friction when our alimentary canal organs move or contract. Mesenteries are double layers of peritoneum. These double layers of peritoneum are great locations for blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves to be held in place. It also holds organs in place. We find a lot of fat also inside mesenteries or these double layers of peritoneum. For example, the greater omentum is a mesentery that lays over most of your abdominal pelvic organs, and it contains a lot of fat. Retroperitoneal organs are posterior to the peritoneum. They usually have one part that is a serosa, the other part adventitia. Intraperitoneal organs are inside completely the peritoneum, so completely surrounded by this serous membrane. Here we can see some examples of intraperitoneal organs, and the orange circle here is representing the visceral peritoneum that surrounds the abdominal pelvic organs. We have a space, the peritoneal cavity, and then we have the parietal peritoneum out here with the outer orange line. We can also see there's locations because of how the alimentary canal and accessory organs are organized where layers of peritoneum abut each other. And when we have double layers of peritoneum, we have a mesentery. Now, not all mesenteries are called something mesentery, even though they're pointing out a dorsal and ventral mesentery in figure 22.5a. There are some mesenteries that are called, for example, omentums. There's a lesser and greater omentum, and we even have things like mesocolon, which are names for mesenteries associated with parts of the colon. Here we can see on the right a retroperitoneal organ. So it sits behind the peritoneum. It is not encased in peritoneum. And then an intraperitoneal organ is a part of the alimentary canal completely surrounded by visceral peritoneum. Peritonitis is inflammation of the peritoneum. It's caused by piercing abdominal wounds. It could be a perforating ulcer or ruptured appendix, something that has damaged the peritoneum. It causes the peritoneal coverings to stick together as that Fluid that lubricates the two layers of the peritoneum seeps out from the peritoneal cavity. Now, it's great that they stick together because if the rupture was caused by inflammation due to bacterial infection, we want to localize that infection. We want to keep everything stuck together and not allow this infection to spread. It becomes very dangerous if a bacterial infection does spread in the peritoneal cavity. We would instead want to quickly treat peritonitis with antibiotics and remove the debris. The blood supply to the digestive system, sometimes called the splanchnic circulation, because branches of the aorta serve digestive organs such as the liver, the spleen, and the stomach. You'd also see things like hepatic, splenic, gastric, and mesenteric as terminology used to talk about the vascular supply to the digestive system. We also want to remind ourselves about the hepatic portal circulation. A portal circulation has two capillary beds connected by portal veins. And the hepatic portal circulation is between the digestive system and the liver, and it consists of a circulation that drains nutrient-rich blood from digestive organs and sends the nutrient-rich blood, but oxygen-deprived blood to the liver for processing to make sure no pathogens or anything that could cause disease has gotten into this blood that essentially is coming from the outside. There are also 4 basic layers to the alimentary canal. We may call them tunics. The layer closest to the lumen is the mucosa. Then we have the submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa. The serosa is the outermost layer of the alimentary canal. It's also known as the visceral peritoneum. So here we can see all 4 layers or tunics of the alimentary canal. We have the mucosa, which has an epithelial layer, underlying connective tissue membrane, and a muscularis mucosa, which is a layer of smooth muscle that's in or a part of the mucosa. There's also the submucosa, mainly areolar connective tissue with glands, lymphatic vessels, and blood vessels. Then there are 2 layers of smooth muscle that make up the muscularis externa. We have both a longitudinal and circular layer, so their fibers are going to be perpendicular to each other. And then we have the outermost membrane, and that's going to be the serosa, also known as the visceral peritoneum. So the mucosa lines the lumen. It has 3 layers, and the different layers perform 1 or all 3 of the following functions. They secrete mucus, digestive enzymes, and hormones, absorb end products of digestion. Those are the monomers from breakdown of biological molecules, such as carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids, and they protect against infectious disease. So you may find things like Peyer's patches in the mucosa, specifically that underlying connective tissue basement membrane. The 3 sublayers are an epithelium, which for most of the digestive tract is going to be simple columnar epithelium. We have a lamina propria, part of that basement membrane, and a muscularis mucosae. So again, the epithelium of the mucosa is generally simple columnar epithelium. We would see this change slightly if we were looking at the oral cavity or the oro or laryngopharynx, and most of the esophagus is going to be stratified squamous epithelium. But in the later parts of the digestive system, so for the rest of the alimentary canal, it would be mainly simple columnar epithelium, underlaid again by some connective tissue. So it can secrete hormones and enzymes. We see mainly that occurring in the stomach and small intestines, but the mucus secreted by the glands that we find in the mucosa are able to ease the food passage from the mouth throughout the anus. The mucosa also has underlying lamina propria under the epithelium, which is loose areolar connective tissue. There may be some lymphoid follicles, a part of the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue in this region as well. And it also contains muscularis mucosae, which is smooth muscle, and this is just involved in local movements of the mucosa, not necessarily peristalsis or segmentation. So let's just look at this image once again. Things that were not pointed out before are things like the blood vessels and enteric nerve plexi that we see in between the muscularis externa layers, and we see throughout the submucosa. So the submucosa is also areolar connective tissue like the lamina propria of the mucosa. It contains blood and lymphatic vessels, lymphoid follicles, and we would find in the submucosa the submucosal nerve plexus. The muscularis externa is responsible for segmentation and peristalsis, muscular movements of the GI tract. The inner circular and longitudinal layers and outer longitudinal layers are able to communicate with each other via the myenteric nerve plexus, and that's located between the two muscle layers. When the circular layer thickens in some areas, it forms sphincters, such as the gastroesophageal sphincter and pyloric sphincter. The serosa is the visceral peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum surrounds alimentary canal organs, and it's also made up of areolar connective tissue covered with a layer of mesothelium, or mesothelium you may know as stratified squamous epithelium. It is replaced by adventitia in organs like the esophagus. So some retroperitoneal organs would also have anteriorly a serosa and posteriorly an adventitia. Example of an organ like that, not a part of the digestive system, but the kidneys. And then once again, let's just go through the basic tunics of the alimentary canal, and those are the mucosa closest to the lumen, followed by the submucosa, then the muscularis externa, and finally the serosa. Let's talk more about those enteric nervous system plexi. So there is an intrinsic nerve supply to the alimentary canal, meaning that we can find networks of nerves in the four layers of the alimentary canal. These enteric neurons serve the GI tract and control motility of these canals. The submucosa nerve plexus is regulating gland secretion and smooth muscle contraction in the mucosa, whereas the myenteric nerve plexus, located between the longitudinal and circular layers of the muscularis externa, is controlling GI tract motility. So the myenteric nerve plexus is able to control things like peristalsis and segmentation. The enteric nerve system is linked to the central nervous system via afferent visceral fibers. These afferent visceral fibers bring information to the central nervous system and synapse with the enteric plexi and are able to communicate via long reflexes. We find that the sympathetic nervous system actually inhibits digestive activities. We're used to the sympathetic nervous system being our fight or flight response of stimulating or increasing activities. That is not the case for the enteric or digestive nervous system. It's actually the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest system, that stimulates digestive activities. So keep in mind that parasympathetic nerve stimuli will increase digestive activities. If you inhibit parasympathetic nerve stimuli, that will decrease digestive activities. And then as an antagonist to the parasympathetic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system impulses inhibit digestive activities. We're next going to look at just some functional anatomy. We'll start with the oral cavity, or the mouth. The oral cavity is also known as the buccal cavity because it's found medial to the buccal region of the body, or the cheeks. It is bounded laterally by the cheeks, anteriorly by the lips, superiorly by the hard and soft palate, and we find the tongue, which is skeletal muscle, within the oral cavity. The oral orifice is the anterior opening of the mouth, bounded by the lips, and we see that the oral cavity is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. We can see here the hard palate and the soft palate. We have the oral orifice, skeletal muscle of the tongue, and we find the tongue inside the oral cavity, so it's going to be between the teeth and the cheeks. And if we go back, we can see the definitions of the hard palate and the soft palate. The hard palate is made up of bone, and the soft palate is made up of skeletal muscle. The end of the soft palate contains the uvula, which projects downward from its free edge into the pharynx. The uvula is able to move superiorly or block off the nasopharynx when we swallow to make sure food does not go up into our nasal cavity, but instead goes down into the rest of our pharynx and then eventually the esophagus. So we can see the uvula here. It would move upwards when swallowing to block off the nasopharynx, making sure food went down. We now see the esophagus behind the windpipe, or what you may know as the trachea. So the esophagus is going to be posterior to the larynx and to the trachea. Looking at other structures, the orbicularis oris and buccinator muscles are found in the cheeks. The oral vestibule is a term for structures within, or the area within, the cheeks and the lips. The oral cavity properly lies within the teeth and gums, and the labial frenulum are the attachments of each lip to the gums. There is a superior and inferior labial frenulum. The superior labial frenulum connects the upper lip to the upper gums, and the inferior labial frenulum connects the lower lip to the lower gums. There's even a lingual frenulum, which connects the tongue to the base of the oral cavity. The tongue is skeletal muscle. Its functions include mixing food with saliva to form a bolus, so it's able to reposition, mix, and kind of chew food with the teeth. It initiates swallowing, speech, and taste. And the intrinsic muscles are able to change the shape of the tongue, while the extrinsic muscles alter the tongue's position. We saw in the previous slide the lingual frenulum. It was that attachment of the tongue to the floor of the mouth. It's important to note that the tongue contains bumps. The bumps are called papillae. There's different types of papillae: the filiform, fungiform, valate, and foliate. Valate papillae are sometimes called circumvallate papillae and can be found near the back of the tongue in a V shape. The V-shaped valate papillae are going to separate the anterior 2/3 of the tongue from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And we see that the posterior 1/3 of the tongue is actually located in the pharynx. Also, that the filiform papillae do not contain taste buds. The rest of the papillae do contain taste buds. Here are the valate papillae. The valate papillae are going to separate posterior 1/3 from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And the tongue is able to produce lingual lipase, which is an enzyme that digests fat, but is not functional until it hits the stomach. So fat digestion does not begin in the oral cavity because this lingual lipase is non-functional in the oral cavity. The terminal sulcus is that division between the front and back of the tongue, and we see that separation at the posterior portion of the valate papillae. You have 3 salivary glands, and next time we're going to talk about the salivary glands, the 3 types and what they produce, and what the salivary glands are responsible for.